Welcome to the Transactional Analysis Podcast. Conversations about the theory, application and spirit of TA. Brought to you in partnership with the United Kingdom Association for Transactional Analysis.
Keith, Graeme, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you both. We're going to start by getting you both to introduce yourselves. Graeme, if I could start with you, if you could say a little bit about who you are, where you come from, what you do, that would be great.
Okay, great. Yeah, I am currently working as an executive coach. I do a lot of work at London Business School. I've been there for about 21 years now. So coaching leaders, really, and how to be better leaders. That's what I do professionally. I've been passionate about TA for 40 odd years. I did my TA 101, my intro back in 1982. And Keith and I met in about 1985, actually. I think I went to join a house in London, a shared house. And Keith was actually going to take a sabbatical for a couple of years into Italy. And I took his place in the house. So that was kind of how we met just before he went off to Italy, and then reconnected and, bonded and built a wonderful friendship that's lasted 40 odd years since. So here we are. And of course, co-author with Keith of Co-Creative TA, which we're both passionate about and here to share with you today.
I did not know that was how you guys met. What an interesting part of the story. Very good.
Let's see if Keith agrees with me. I don't know.
Okay. Keith, welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself?
What's that thing they say about it, the 70s and 80s, if you remember it, you weren't there. I think that's about right. Yeah, so kia ora koutou, greetings to all. My day job is Professor of Psychotherapy at Auckland University of Technology, and I have quite a thriving private practice, mostly in the TA world, a little bit in my person-centered world, teaching and training and supervising. Yeah, I actually thought we met on a 101 or at a party or something, but it's interesting because we do have slightly different recollections of when we met, and we were trying to agree about this when we were writing the introduction to the Co-Creative book. So the Co-Creative article came out in 2000, the book we wrote or put together in 2014. I was getting a little bit sort of agitated about, I'm sure I've got a diary somewhere. And I thought, Graeme, you sort of pulled me back and said, well, wait a minute, we believe in multiple realities. So we ended up writing 2 introductions to the book, which is really good because it kind of represents part of what we're passionate about in Co-Creative TA as part of a constructivist approach. So there we go. And I'm still passionate about Co-Creative TA and also about radical psychiatry and TA. And increasingly, I think people are asking me, maybe us, about, well, what's the links between those two, which might be something we get into.
Great.
Graeme, if I come back to you, if people have never heard of Co-Creative TA before and you were to give them a 1 or 2 sentence explanation as to what Co-Creative TA is, what would you say?
It's an interpretation of TA that builds on a strand of Eric Berne, the originator's thinking, because Berne wrote in different ways about the same ideas. And I think there's some confusion perhaps in the literature there. Not necessarily a bad thing, but different perspectives. And I think Co-Creative TA picks up one of those strands, certain ideas within TA that certainly Berne talked about and we have elaborated on. So I think it encapsulates certain ideas about what health is, what pathology is, or what goes wrong within the TA conceptual framework. It very much emphasizes or re-emphasizes health, or certainly seeks to rebalance what we thought of as an imbalance in TA, too much talking about pathology, what goes wrong. I think we wanted to articulate a version of TA that can account for health as well as pathology. And also, I think the other thing that for me is important about Co-Creative TA, we wanted to talk about we-ness, the idea that we can talk about in a much more dynamic way about the importance of relationship, less of a focus on the individual. They're probably the main things that I think we wanted to emphasize as we constructed this.
Brilliant.
Glad you asked him first, John.
Giving you some time to think.
Yeah. And one of the things I forgot to say in my introduction is because I think it's obvious, but I'm based in Auckland in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So it's my morning. So Graeme's more warmed up. So that was a good way around.
Sip your coffee, Keith. You'll catch up, I'm sure.
I'll catch up.
Probably overtake, you know. You
I think it's also catching up with Keith, not the other way around. He's a day ahead of us. Yeah, I'm curious, Keith, if you would, if that's what you would also say, or if you have a slightly different slant on it.
No, I would actually, well, I wouldn't have put it so eloquently. I think certainly that kind of sorting some of the contradictions in Berne, and I went on to do that later, particularly in relation to ego states, again, with Graeme's encouragement, because Berne did say two different things about ego states, and we really kind of elaborated that more so in the book. I guess the other aspect is that it does offer a critical flavor. I mean, in the original article, we were very clear to name our kind of sources and influences, and they were essentially about field theory and social constructivism. But I think health psychology is major, and absolutely informs the whole rereading of TA from a co-creative perspective. And you see that in, transactions, ego states, scripts and games. And the other strand I would probably emphasize as well is the kind of critical thinking that underlies our view and informed our critique. We didn't name it as such, but it was sort of implicit and line.
Were there influences from within TA as well, Keith? You named some of the external influences there that drove your writing that initial article.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the main theoretical influences were partly Jim and Barbara Allen from the constructivist narrative approach. That was a strong influence. We had certain agreements with Erskine in terms of his ego state model, which he developed also from, actually I realized later that it wasn't kind of his model, but the idea of the integrated adult actually has an earlier link to James and Savary. So there's a kind of link there. And also our experiences within TA, our critique was quite experiential. That's really what brought us together in terms of, apart from being mates and starting off our training when I came back from Italy. We both trained together in that first year in 87, I think. That we had, by the time we'd finished our training and we did our CTA in Maastricht together, we had quite a lot of critiques based on our experiences. And so that was kind of what fueled our passion about staying in TA, but kind of making it ours, having that rereading, which actually I think is a kind of process everybody does. If they stay in TA, they kind of make it theirs in some way.
Yeah. You've said a couple of things that I was wondering if you could clarify, but especially those who are students, those curious and interested. You mentioned the word constructivism, social constructivism, or in constructivists, and you also mentioned rereading. So I'm curious, firstly, what is the constructivist approach? What's that philosophy or that idea?
Well, I'm wondering, Graeme is equally a constructivist, so I'm wondering if you want to share the burden, feel that.
Yeah, as Keith said, we were very influenced by James and Barbara Allen and their work on constructivism, and they won the Eric Berne Memorial Award for their work, and it was very, very influential. And one of the things that they talk about in one of their articles, which I just loved, which is everyone is entitled to more than one story. So, for example, and I just think it was brilliant the way they were in some ways challenging and deconstructing some ideas about script as though somehow it's one immutable story that, is that we're living out in our lives. And some of their work, for example, is, some of the ideas that they play with. Tell your life story as a tragedy. Tell your life story as a comedy. Tell your life story as an epic adventure. There are so many different ways you can take the same data, the same touch points, the same experiences, if you like, but you can frame them, you can weave them together, you can construct different stories, different meanings from the same or similar experiences. And for me, that had a sort of vitality about it, I think, as an approach. And that, in essence, embodies the constructivist approach, that actually we can construct multiple and different meanings, and that we do that in an ongoing way throughout life. And we can change, we can flip, we can pivot, we can involve other people in helping us rewrite these whole notion of who we are, what we're here for, and where we're going.
Wow.
Yes, wow. Great summary and great liveliness. He's got style, that man. Love him. And the social bit is the kind of as the idea that certain of these stories, and particularly identities, are socially constructed. So gender is often socially constructed. So that cut the social bit, and both of what Graeme and I said, you can then see in how we offered a different idea about script theory and about even the script matrix, where we deconstructed the sort of traditional heteronormative mum, dad, male, female, and kind of really pulled it apart and said, well, first of all, let's identify what the polarity, what a story is. And it might be about gender, it might be about sexuality, it might be about race, dynamics of oppression or whatever. And so those are the kind of the polarities that then we look at in terms of script theory.
Do you think that TA theory is a construct?
Absolutely.
High five, yes.
High five, wow.
So what influence does that then have if you're saying, nothing is true, but yet you buy into this theory where it's like, no, this is absolutely, this one here that I'm using is the best one or the right one.
See, I think I found it difficult sometimes when I was working as a TA trainer, sometimes teaching students TA, holding in mind there's so many different interpretations of TA, so many different ways you can talk about stuff. And some of these are kind of quite at odds with each other in terms of underlying assumptions. And it felt like mental gymnastics sometimes. For me, as the trainer, never mind the students, to try and convey some of the complexity here. There was something about, I don't see it as co-creative TA is the right or the only or the way to think about TA. I don't think it that way at all. I think this is just essentially two TA students, because I guess maybe we were TA practitioners and qualified practitioners, but nonetheless, we were trying to figure out something that made sense for us. And fundamentally, that's where it's at. It's like, this is what makes sense to us. Here, have it, play with it, see what you think. And I'm sure it's true for Keith as well. I've no desire to actually get other people to think like we do. We're just saying, this is what makes sense to us here. We're putting this into the conversation, not wanting to dominate the conversation, just saying, this is what we think. What do you think?
A good example of that, I think, a very live example for me was this last week when I taught what's an extended TA 101 at my university here in Auckland. I taught on the 101, I taught the two different sets of models that Berne put up. So it's just like, Berne had different ideas about ego states. Here's one, here's another. You pays your money and you buys your model, whichever one suits. My preference is to be consistent, but equally, it's like it's up to you. And that's, to me, a kind of free choice, which fits with my philosophy of education and so on. And it puts it out there and it treats people like adults rather than, you've got to have this particular view and then this, and then, it's only in your third year that you can do co-creative or medical psychiatry or whatever. So absolutely. And the other example, to answer your point, John, is, ego states, for instance, themselves. That's a particular way of thinking about personality that has a particular history embedded in American ego psychology, post-Second War, etc., etc. Every theory has a context and a construct. And I think it's better that we know that. And so we can choose whether even the idea of ego states is a useful way to think about personality. So that's kind of, I guess, the ultimate sort of deconstruction that we're offering.
Nice. I want to pick back up on the health piece again, because I think that's also a really interesting aspect of co-creative TA, and obviously has popped up elsewhere as well. I mean, I started my training in psychotherapy, but it was very clear to me when I did some educational TA training that the focus there was much more on sonology from the get-go. And I was very curious in the early days of learning TA about some of the total contradictions between training in the two fields at the same time. So do you also think that there's an element here of field specific that comes to the fore?
Can I just, before you answer that question, John, can I get you to define what sonology is? Because there's a lot of people I've come across who don't know what.
Yeah, sure. I actually don't know the actual definition, but I know that sanos in, I think it's Greek, is health and is the opposite to pathos, which is ill health or disease or pathology. And I use it usually just to refer to what these guys here are talking about, which is taking more of a health focus.
Thank you. Great
I think
job.
those words are actually in our original article. We talk about psychopathology and psychosanology.
Yeah, from Antonovsky's work in health. That's kind of the reference, Antonovsky, 1979-ish. Yeah.
Yeah, you're asking about field specific. That was your question, John. And it's interesting because I think certainly at the time, I wasn't training in any other field than the clinical field. So I don't have a contrast in terms of training experience. That wasn't part of the context for me. I don't know if about you, Keith. Did you any experience of the other training in the other fields? No, we were both immersed in the clinical field.
Yeah.
But it's interesting taking a look back historically at that time. We were writing in the late 90s. An article was published early 2000. So funnily enough, it coincides with the birth of positive psychology. We didn't know that at the time. It's only in hindsight you look back on that and say, wow, that's an interesting parallel. I wonder if there was something in the air. This question about why are we focusing on what's going wrong all the time? Are we not just stroking what's wrong as we do that? So I think that question was there for us. I don't think at the time it certainly wasn't informed by perhaps other fields of TA.
The response to the article I thought was interesting because we were definitely coming at this from a clinical perspective, although we did think that what we had to say was relevant to other fields, but we, were cautious about that. But what was interesting is the response to the article was much more positive. And the initial response was much more positive from the other fields, particularly education, organisation. And then by then, I think the clinical field had split into counselling and psychotherapy. So that was an interesting response, I thought, and also from people in different countries and different cultures, but other than the UK. I think particularly our emphasis on psychology resonated more with people from non-Western, Northern cultures.
Yeah. Was there any resistance to what you published? Did you get any criticism from any corners?
We were warned that there might be by Jim Allen, actually.
Really?
Because we sent an early draft of our article off to Jim to kind of take a look at and give us some feedback. He was very generous in his feedback. It was wonderful. One of the things he really said in that is, I got a lot of flack, when he introduced his constructivist ideas. And obviously he's a clinician, so he was within that field. But he said he got a lot of flack for what he was bringing in, like he was, seen as attacking more traditional TA perspectives. And he warned us. He said, look, you might get flack. But actually, we didn't. I don't recall being... I think Keith and I have probably critiqued each other more heavily than we've received criticism from others in the TA world. It's my experience. What do you think, Keith?
I think that's right. I think there was definitely, for me, there was a kind of criticism in the silence from the clinical psychotherapy community. And I think that some people think it's a little bit lightweight. I've heard this, somebody was reporting a senior TSTA saying, oh, it's only counselling, it's not real, it's not psychotherapy. And so I think there's a lot of armchair, untheorized, prejudicial criticism out there, but nobody's kind of come out before we got the award, nobody came out and said, I'm going to write an article that's critical of Co-Creative. And interesting, I think a lot of students like it. A lot of people there's a kind of humanistic, I think, clarity. I mean, one of the things that I think we're good at is translating complex ideas like Berne. I mean, we're very Bernian in the sense of, going back and making things simpler, even our translation of terms like, co-creative confirmations, games, which encompasses both positive and negative or whatever, is that it's easier language, I think.
I remember I was going to run a workshop at a TA conference, and one of the participants came up to me in the break and said, I read your book. And I said, yeah, what'd you think? He said, I hated it. He said, in fact, I hated you and Keith. I said, why? He said, well, it felt like you were pulling apart everything I'd been learning about for a few years now. And I found it really, really disturbing. He said, but actually, you got me to think at a deeper level, and I'm grateful to you for that. It was a brilliant kind of comment. I thought it was lovely. But there was a sense that, He hated our book and he hated you and I, Keith, as part of the process of deconstructing.
Yeah, job done. I also think, that takes me back to something I wanted to pick up on, something I think you'd said, John, which is this sort of the meta perspective. I don't know if you used that word, but I was thinking one of the aspects of the award that we got in 2020 for this work, the part of the rubric was for their work on co-creative TA, and also introducing meta perspective. And I think it's that idea that, going back to what you said, Graeme, like we've never claimed it as a school. We've been quite clear that it's not a school. We don't want it to be as another school, even though sometimes people do. And it's more about that rereading, and it's more about thinking for yourself. I sometimes say, I'm not selling co-creative. Here I am teaching co-creative, but guess what? I'm not selling it. What I am selling is thinking for yourself. And if this is a way of saying, look, there's this and there's that, what do you think? There's this and there's that, what do you think? I think that's the job that we did, and that's the aspect of the award that I also want to acknowledge and claim. It's like that. Was it a friend of yours, Graeme, who read the book and he said that he was agreeing with you and agreeing with me? And I think that's a lovely example.
Yeah, my mate Tim, he read the book. He said, oh, what was that? That was interesting. He said, I noticed when you and Keith were dialoguing and we critique each other throughout the book, it's part of what we're doing. He said, I noticed I wasn't just asking, do I agree with Graeme or do I agree with Keith? I was asking, what do I think?
It's one of the things I really like about your book, though it's co-authored, but co-authored kind of differently. There's your opinions put forward, Graeme, your opinions, Keith, where you disagree. You were writing letters to each other, is that right? Or writing emails to each other?
Yes.
It's a record of your dialogue over the wrestling with some of these issues. And I think there's something really important that you're demonstrating in that as well. I really enjoyed that part of it.
Yeah, I think the structure of the book, I was really, really pleased because we had this sort of 4 pieces that we'd written. We realized that we'd written, I was presenting them here. It's actually giving my son some credit for suggesting that. He said, why don't you put those things together in the book? And I approached Graeme, and Graeme said, yes, but how about pushing the boat out and having a dialogue about each of these pieces? So the structure of the book is that we dialogue about each of the pieces, as you say, Matt, and it's kind and good that you picked that up. And then we gave that manuscript, as far as we got, to 5 colleagues to reflect on, and then we reflect on their comments. And so the whole thing becomes this very reflective, open dialogue, I think, about the nature of TA theory. And that's going back to your point, John, about, there's nothing fixed, but let's think about what we're being taught or what we're being presented as a way of thinking about, whether it's personality or life story or development or whatever.
More generally, one of the things that I like about TA, generally actually, and not just co-creative TA, is like one of the ways in which I hold it as a theory. The word that stands out for me is generative. I think it's generative theory. I think it's theory that it's a way of framing experience, making sense of experience that generates possibilities. That's what I love about it. I don't see it as a tightly rigid, overly defined system that tells you what you should do or tells you what you shouldn't do. So it's not prescriptive or proscriptive. For me, it's generative, and that's what I love about it as an approach. I've always loved that about TA, and I think it's very much in the spirit of what I think, how Keith and I talk about it, the theory, and how we offer it for people to use and develop and adapt. And but also hopefully people are using it to support and create new possibilities. That for me that's the point of the theory.
That's a great word to use, Graeme. I think that's the first time I've heard you use it, and that's lovely. I'm wondering how it links a little bit with our idea, and again, something you articulate very well about co-influence. Remember somebody asking us in a workshop and saying, what's the thing? If one word, and Graeme came right, quick as a flash, says that it's about co-influence. It's about how we are influenced by and how we influence the other, whatever that other is, whether it's...
The phrase would be ongoing mutual influence.
Thank you.
We've taken from intersubjectivity.
Got all phrases down.
Been working at it for a few years, Matt.
Quarter of a century, my friend.
I know.
But I think that I'm linking that to your points about generativity, because that if we allow ourselves to be influenced by the other, including theory, then we can generate our own. So that can meet there's something about that generativity is created, is perpetuated, hopefully, through the idea of co-influence. And that, I think, also gets to the heart of, I guess, values that underpinning co-creativity, like freedom to think for yourself rather than over-adapt to trainers.
Can I ask a question around this idea of influence? Keith, I know you work within the person-centered community. When you're working in coaching, how important do you think it is for TA students or professionals as well, qualified individuals, to seek information from outside the TA world, to go after other influences that are going to help to support them coming up with their own creative ways or their own individual thoughts and processes on TA theory?
Yes, absolutely crucial. And I think it's more that I think we do inhabit different worlds as people, as whatever we're involved with. So it's more about encouraging people to test TA out against their existing worlds, whether that's different disciplines, different faiths, different cultures, and so on, rather than seeing TA as a sort of isolated bubble you have to kind of lose yourself in and become a disciple and so on. So I think it's more about acknowledging the reality and seeing the benefit of that kind of reality testing.
I would agree. I mean, I think it's very evident in our literature. Take the TAJ for a start, and let alone all the books that are out there. There are lots of people creatively exploring the interface and the mutual influence between TA and other disciplines. As you talked there, John, about different fields within TA and how different fields influence each other. For me, that is, it's a mark of health, that you can have some sense of integrity in whatever professional system you're identifying with. But that's not rigid. If it's rigid, it's a pathology. It's an overly rigid boundary. It needs to be a semi-permeable boundary that allows for the mutual influence.
I'm sitting with something, since you said that TA is generative, Graeme. It triggered a whole stream of thoughts for me about like, oh yeah, this annoys me about this, and I get frustrated with that, and it is the fact, I can't remember which one of you said it now, that TA is a theory first and foremost, but often within the TA community, at least from my perspective, we talk about it as if it's an application very quickly. And I struggle with that sometimes. I liked what you said, Keith, about co-creative not being a school, because the jump from theory to doing for me is quite a big leap. I know that's not maybe the case for everybody, but I like to be quite thoughtful. And I always say that TA isn't what I do, it's what informs what I do. But it hasn't necessarily been set up that way because it's in the name. Transactional analysis is a doing thing. It suggests you're analyzing transactions. That's what Berne started doing. Do you think we've moved past it being a doing thing now, and that it is really more a body of theory first and foremost, and that co-creative TA is about expanding the body of theory rather than the application?
I think it can be either, but one of the ideas that we introduced in the original article was the idea of transactional design, not just transactional analysis, which again, analysis, I really like Edward de Bono and some of his ideas, and again, it's just like it's really interesting work in terms of creativity and how do you generate new possibilities. And he's really saying, look, analysis is about what is. You analyze what's here. Design is about what could be. That's about possibilities. And we could think about that in terms of theory or application, I think, in terms of how we think about things, how we might deconstruct ideas we've previously accepted and get curious about what else we might create, how else we might think or reflect on experience. And then, so that would be the theoretical aspect. I think the application aspect is how might we then bring that as a methodology in our work? how might we bring design ideas, if you like, design principles into our work. So we are then thinking in terms of perhaps prototyping new ideas or new ways of being, and what might that look like in practice. So I think we can talk about this in terms of theory and application. But I love, John, that you see a value in making the distinction. I think that's so important. And sometimes what gets in the way of actually being able to play with theory is someone saying, oh, well, how would that work in practice? And you kill the creativity.
Exactly.
Like, can we just play with the ideas for a while first? Can we give lots of space for this? That, the application might emerge at some later point in time, but can we make some space to think and to think differently and open up new possibilities and deconstruct some old ideas?
That's a really nice permission.
Yeah, although it's not a permission technically.
No.
That's another thing to deconstruct, isn't it? Because it's okay to, rather than that we are permissive in this co-creation, and particularly in education and training. Because I also think, John, you were picking up on something about theory becoming, where I went to with your kind of reflection, was that we have a lot of theory, but we kind of reify it. And in this sense, TA can become a bit theory and model heavy and be speaking to itself in a rather sort of solipsistic, sort of self-referential way. Oh, it doesn't fit with that theory and so on. But these theories are stories, they're narratives. So if you come at it from this perspective, this more constructivist and deconstructivist constructive perspective, then again, it's like, let's play and let's think for ourselves. And that means then we all become theorists and practitioners.
And I know Keith's come up with this wonderful term of the integrating adult in your 2003 article, Keith, which is a brilliant elaboration of the ideas that we originally discussed. But in there, I want to throw in the idea of, well, what about the disintegrating adult?
Yeah.
That we need to disintegrate what we think we know in order to open up the space to explore some new possibility in some new ways of being.
I agree. I'm just catching up with that because, Graeme, you were very encouraging of me to go away and do that work on the integrating adult. And I think it is a good piece of work, and thank you for that. But yeah, 20 years later or whatever, I'm going, I think we need to talk more about disintegration. And I remember I was talking to Ukrainian colleagues about trauma and thinking about you might have resolved quite a lot of your trauma, personal trauma, whatever, and then something happens like a country invades you, and then you might disintegrate in some way and be re-traumatized. I mean, apart from external trauma and so on. So I have been thinking in the last couple of years more about disintegration or disintegrating.
I have a different angle than you here, Keith, though, because the way you're describing it, you sound like you're more describing it more as a kind of regression into chaotic defense, perhaps. I mean it in a progressive way. So that's what I'm
necessarily, but yeah, maybe that's something. That's maybe something that we can.
This is what we do all the time, guys. Honestly, it is what we have always done for years. So we tussle a lot together.
Yeah.
That's an interesting piece as well. The co-creative rereading came out of dialogue between you guys when you were describing your early ruminations together. The fantasy was of you two sat at the back of your class talking about what the tutor was saying and having, questions about it and then taking it away. How long did it take you from those early discussions to publishing the paper in 2000?
For me, we started together and we ended together. I took some years out, so I took 7 years of my training, but we ended together at Maastricht and did our CTA together in 1994. And then there was the question of, would we go on to be PTSTAs? And I think, Graeme, you became a PTSTA before I did. And there was a couple of, I think I didn't become a PTSTA till 97. But in that period, 94 to 97, 98, we were talking, my memory is that we were talking about, we like TA, but there's things we don't like about it. And if we are to be training in TA, we're going to need to be more convinced. So one definition of co-creative TA is that it's two friends finding their own way to integrate and disintegrate, to spit stuff out, to disagree. And the co-creative TA is our way of thinking about that. So the bulk of the writing was done 98, 99, 97, 98, 99, because it takes about a year to get published. And it was published the first issue of 2000. So that was the kind of period where we were really tussling. And in that period, I mean, we were friends, our families were friends, we used to meet up. We're also it's known now that and we've been out about being in a writing group with Helena and Charlotte during that time. And we are testing ideas and really making our way with how we would be transactional analysts and teaching and supervising transactional analysis.
Is that like the disintegrating, as in you're breaking apart the models?
Yeah, pulling things apart. I mean, I remember one of the discussions we had where I was at one point pitching the idea of a 2 ego state model, which was basically past and present. And this was towards the end. This is probably 98, one of the walks on the beach, I remember, at Arnside, where you used to live, Graeme. And us having a real tussle about, well, would we could push it that far, or do we, how far do we want to push that, or take people with us, and so on. And we ended up, I think, compromising quite rightly.
Yes. I said to Keith, you can push it that far if you want, but I don't want to.
Yeah. So I agreed with him. But it's that kind of stretching debate. Like we had that debate. How do we think that way? And then what do we come back to or go forward to, and so on? It's exactly those. So co-creative TA is also an example of the sort of things we're talking about and what you were saying, Graeme, about design.
Well, I know, Keith, you are a prolific author and you published, hundreds of peer-reviewed papers. I mean, they're quite an accomplished academic. But I remember us having a conversation where you were saying, "Oh yeah, that paper on co-creative TA that we wrote, it's never taken me so long to write a paper." Do you remember that?
Mm.
And we tussled, we chewed, we went off and read stuff and kind of got more exploring, researching, come back, sharing what we discovered, throwing it around with each other. We did a lot of chewing, I think, and a lot of talking in the process of leading up to actually probably our final draft.
Yeah. I also remember that towards the end, when we'd done what is most of the article, we also had a conversation about the principles. And
yes.
having done all that, we were keen to offer the principles on which we were building, because partly one of our critiques is that often people don't say that. They don't say where they're coming from or what they're informed by. They just say, this is it. This is true. So we then wrote the 3 principles, which I think are still stood the test of time, at least for a quarter of a century. And then we kind of put those up front as the basic. Well, Graeme was referring to the first one, which is the principle of we-ness, which is very much based on ideas about we psychology, and was also at the time a bit of a critique of the kind of naming and shaming about symbiosis, that if you use the word we, that was automatically symbiotic and negative. But do you want to share the principles, Graeme? That's the first principle of we-ness.
Then the principle of shared responsibility. I think what we noticed in terms of trends in the TA literature and how we talked about the application of TA, John, was the notion that somehow the emphasis was on the personal responsibility of the individual who wants to go through a change process, and how it's important that they are taking responsibility to relate in a different way, maybe it's in a game-free way or a cross-transaction, but the emphasis on personal responsibility, it's like the light bulb joke, it has to want to change. So that was kind of one school, it was very much a traditional TA frame. And then Richard Erskine came along and developed the integrative approach. And I love his ideas I think he did a lot of really, really healthy deconstructing of adult ego state and clarifying these different models of ego states in TA. That really gave us a lovely platform to build on. But as a methodology, he was really emphasizing an approach from self-psychology, which is more about the therapist in a way. The responsibility is more towards the therapist in terms of their empathic capacity, their ability to empathize, to attune to the client. So what we saw was this swing of responsibility from it being towards the client, and then somehow it's swinging towards the practitioner. And I think we wanted to offer a third way. We would say, let's talk about shared responsibility. And it might well be that the practitioner has certain professional responsibilities within the relationship that the client doesn't hold responsibility for, but essentially between, the client and practitioner, or practitioner and clients, if it's a group, there are shared dynamics here that will either be curative, moving in terms of new possibilities, or perhaps regressive in terms of recreating the old familiar transferential patterns. And I think that's also what's embedded in that second principle of shared responsibility.
I agree, although I would refer what you're referring to as methodology, I'd see more as method, like the actual practice rather than the ology of it.
Get on with the third principle, Keith.
Sometimes he doesn't like to be challenged. Well, interestingly, the third principle is present-centered development. There, you see, just offering a bit of present-centered development.
Brilliant.
The idea that, following on from the second principle, the idea that we can basically change and learn and develop in the present, and that's not dependent on some sort of past-centered regressive or regressive work, because this is also a criticism of that. Those slogans, it's never too late to have a happy childhood, go and do a free child workshop and so on. So we were reclaiming the impact of that. Your development change takes place in the present and doesn't rely on regressive work. That's the third principle. I sometimes joke, at Metanoia, there was particularly Sue Fish, who I loved dearly and learned a lot from. She had a mug with a big, it's like a slogan on, it's never too late to have a happy childhood. And I always had a bit of a reaction to that. My slogan, it changes, but it would need a much bigger mug. But it's something like, it is too late to have the happy childhood that you didn't have. But it's not too late to grieve the loss of that, and to work on the past in the present to assure the future, which is, that last bit is almost a paraphrasing a quote from Berne.
Right. Nice.
But
I'm curious, because you've critiqued ego states heavily in some ways and, flipped the switch on looking away from what's wrong to where health might be. On other elements of TA theory, and if they came up for some of your tussle, like sometimes I'm quite critical of driver theory, for example, when it comes to neurodiversity. I think that driver theory often completely discounts the reality of neurodiversity. And I'm just curious about where it extended to for you guys in your rereading and tearing apart. Did you go beyond Berne's work, or did it kind of stay with his original thinking?
Well, we talked a little bit about ego states, but let's move on to talk about transactions. How about that for a kind of a segue into another major kind of aspect of TA theory? So I think one of the things that we were curious about was, it's like, if you adopt this model of ego states, what are the implications for transactions? Then what? So if we're talking about the notion of adult as being our kind of healthy base, then what does that look like in transactions? And again, we can draw on Berne here, so because we're not reinventing Berne, we're just taking some aspects of what he said and building on them to a more coherent frame. So Berne, for example, in the Hello book, talks about the cross transaction, and he talks about the transference transaction and the counter-transference transaction. These are wonderful ways where he's talking about parent and child ego states being involved to create what he calls, quote, causes the most trouble in the world and causes the second most trouble in the world. That's the way he's talking about transference and counter-transference there, which I think is fascinating. So if you take the transference away, what are you left with? You're left with health in that frame. People have different ideas about transference and what that means, but this is what's coming out of that reading of Berne. So then if we think about the adult transaction, then we're thinking about what's happening between two people that's healthy, that's adaptive, where we're influencing each other mutually for the benefit of self and other. How are we doing that in an ongoing way? So one of the things I think you're referring to there, John, is a way in which we might use some outmoded idea of theory, then we might be using it in a way that is oppressive in relation to, in this case, a neurodiverse group of people, but how we kind of have to be reflective in an ongoing way in terms of our understanding of what people's experience is, and how do we relate with each other in an ongoing mutual way that actually is beneficial for the people involved. And our understanding of that is going to keep evolving as we keep learning more about human psychology, human physiology. That's going to keep on moving, and it should. And how we kind of keep track of that and keep that evolving that's about the ongoing adult mutual influence. How do we do that? How do we do that in a way that's open and respectful and keeps updating?
Nice. And what I'm hearing there is it's present-centered, that dialogue, and this shared responsibility and the we-ness are all in the midst of that, and being present with each other in that.
And for me, that's not necessarily about the practitioner being ever more attuned to the needs of a neurodiverse client or client group, because that's the one-way responsibility. It's a little bit patronizing, actually. It's about collectively and as a group and as a partnership of practitioner-client working together to actually, find out how do we help each other at a deeper level. John, what's your response to that?
Digesting.
Okay, good. I love it.
It's definitely stimulated something for me. I quite like the idea that you're proposing about the two-way responsibility aspect of it. Something that popped into my head is working with a client in a way that you're working side by side rather than with a up-down dynamic or a front, or looking at each other straight on. Like I often go and walk with my clients side by side, and that just popped into my head, that's a way of living the principle of shared responsibility, and that the practitioner not being the expert or needing to have all the answers. Yeah,
I agree. And there's a parallel there about the theorist or the theory not being the expert and having all the answers. So you asked earlier about, we tended to start with Berne, and I think that's important in terms of the kind of academic rigor of that this is the guy who started things, and he also there's enough contradictions in his work to keep us busy for a while. This is what I've been doing a lot since and more recently. But I think there are, we've also mentioned other theorists since Berne that we would both agree with and disagree with. And I think this is all about creating that space for a more contemporary take on the world. We've had about 100 years of psychotherapy and the world's getting worse. And that was 20 years ago, I think, 25 years ago. And in one of the chapter in my latest book, I kind of echoed that by referring to the chapter on ego states as we've had 66 years of ego states and the world's getting worse. So, I think we need to keep constantly revise theory in order to help us explain and work with the world. The problem comes up when you bump up against universalists, people who, like Tabby Kaler, for instance, about drivers. Good luck with proposing another driver or demolishing the driver theory.
Which you did, didn't you, at one point?
Yes, which I did, and got into trouble, at least from Tabby Kaler and his mates, who basically said there's only ever been 5 drivers, and that's true for forever. So that, there's a universalism, exactly the opposite of what Graeme's talking about. You're talking about Graeme, which is this fixed idea that there's only one theory and it's always true forever and a day. And we do have that in TA, and that's some of what we're up against.
It reminds me of that song, Red Flowers Are Red and Green Leaves Are Green. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but it's just kind of this teacher telling kids that this is, how flowers are, and that's it. They can't be any other color. That popped into my head about the drivers. I think some of the danger actually with TA theory is that it's so accessible on one level and can make so much sense to people so quickly. Like, I remember when I started learning TA first, being like, oh, this just answered all of these questions I've had about myself or other people. That then we kind of get into the universality thing, or I know I'm guilty of that. And I start thinking I'm spotting it everywhere and I can figure it out and I'm really clever. And actually what I'm beginning to realize is that people's psychology and people are a lot more complex than TA theory, and need to be really, really, really careful about how we apply it and how we make sense of each other using it. Has been my latest reflection on that, I think. drivers are a thing for sure. I think, I get it, but they're not ever present everywhere all the time,
I like your reflections, John. And for me, it speaks again to something I like about TA. I think it can be so accessible, and yet I think it also has depth. And I think it depends how we hold it. I love that mix. And I love what Berne was striving for. I think that was important to him. Can we take some of the jargon out of the psychoanalytic world and distill some of those valuable insights, but somehow make them more accessible? And how do you do it without dumbing it down? How can we strive for the accessibility, which for me, is a really important principle, and yet still keep open the depth? I think TA can be used in a way that actually straddles the two. And another metaphor I have for TA in that regard is sometimes I think of it as a bit like a graphical user interface for contemporary psychology. So a bit like, we go to the Google homepage, it's very simple. But we know there's a lot of technology behind the scenes. And I think that's a way in which we can also hold TA theory. We can use it as a user interface. And visually, it's really, really exciting. It's rich. It's powerful. It kind of touches people and helps them see other new ways forward. I think that's wonderful. And it's also a window into a lot of contemporary psychology. So in terms of like the transactions thing I was talking about before, we can think in terms of adult relating as embracing both implicit and explicit processes. We can think of both. So we can key it into contemporary neuroscience in interesting way. I mean, I just think for me, it's very exciting and it's very open-ended, but that's another metaphor, another way in which I would think of TA, not as reductive, but as more of a window into a complex world.
Beautiful.
Can I ask, if you were to go back and add anything to your article of 2000, 26 years on, is there anything that would be different or updated now?
I don't think so. And that said, I would say a bit more about health, and as much about health psychology and critical thinking as we did about field theory and social constructivism. And I would have tidied up some of the diagrams because we compromised on, I think it was the script helix, where we reverted to the single circle rather than the moving circles, which has maybe led to some confusion. It was entirely a kind of technical thing. We didn't perhaps push that as far as we could have done. There's probably only a couple of things. I mean, they're almost like sort of editorial things, but I don't think I'd change anything about what we did. I think the vision was right. And I think the fact that it's sustained as long as it did, I think the fact that we got the award in 2020 is credit to the longevity of it, that it's kind of stood the test of time. So I'm pretty happy with it as it stood. And as Graeme, as you acknowledged, we spent a good couple of years on that.
Yeah, it's also the most cited article in the history of the TAJ. High five. So, no, I wouldn't change anything. No, I think it's of its time. Yeah, really thrilled, really proud of what we did together, Keith. The chewing that led to a publication, and the chewing and ongoing kind of exploring that we've done since and will probably continue to do. And I'm really excited about that and looking forward to it. I don't think I would change a word.
I'm just thinking this is like a 25-year review.
Yeah. So we have a bit different. I probably would change a few words and tweak and do that, and that's kind of my thing. But I think I'm absolutely with you, Graeme. I think what it's led to, I'm really humbled by the fact that it's led to so much interest. There's been a group of 6 colleagues meeting together for probably about 10 years based on this. There's programs based on it. We wrote the acceptance speech. We noted something like 20 terms or concepts that we'd introduced to Co-Creative TA. The 2014 book, I think, is great, and still, people are still buying it. We've just put into Karnak a proposal for a second volume, in other words, an edited volume of new material about co-creativity. So I had a lovely dialogue with Alistair Berlin, a TA UK-based colleague. There's publications, there's podcasts. Other than this is obviously going to be the best one, but there are other podcasts that were created, I think, under Paul Robinson's guidance through UCATA. I think we're up to about 50 publications, including podcasts on Co-Creative TA. So it's been hugely influential and growing. And I remember Graeme and I saying, after we'd finished the book in 2014, the next one will be written by other people. And it is being written by other people. We're involved, but essentially it's other people. So our work is done. We'll still go on arguing the toss till for hopefully another 25 years, but we'll see.
Great. And I think it speaks to the benefit of your robust conversations with each other as to how well it's lasted, that you can look back and say, no, actually, it's great. All of the theory still stands. It's clear that for me, one of the things that I really enjoyed about that paper was the critiquing and the examining and the bringing together the 4 pillars of TA, the script, the transactions, ego states and games, wasn't it, I think? And you made that all make sense together. I'm really grateful for that. And I've really appreciated, I've read that paper numerous times, and it's really influenced my thought processes. And I'm sure this is the reason why it's been cited so often. So yeah, a lot of appreciation. I'm sure I speak on everybody's behalf. I mean, you've already got the award, haven't you, to represent that? But yeah, it's a great piece of work. So
thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
And I think some of our, robustness with each other it's rooted in deep friendship.
Yeah.
It's,
this is also modeling co-creativity, right?
Yeah.
Except we're not modeling anything. Modeling, I spit on modeling.
It's very difficult to have a conversation with John. Just bear with him. He's fine,
Because modeling is based on operant conditioning from behaviorism. So this is the thing about looking at the genealogy of these things. And it's based on the idea that I do something in order for you to interject it, swallow it, copy it. We're not doing that. So there is a serious part. I mean, I'm joking, but there's also, when people say modeling, you can see my reaction. No, we're doing. We might be demonstrating something. We're doing. But it's you that does what's that Piagetian metaphor, that you chew the olive and you spit the pip out. You do the chewing over and take in what it is that you want.
Yeah, I'm doing it from adult consciously.
You're doing it from
here and now. Yeah.
And consciously and unconsciously.
Yeah.
But we're not doing it, or I'm not doing anything in order that people copy me.
It's good for you to say that out loud and helpful for me to hear.
Good. Yeah, so we should stop using this word modeling.
We've been told.
We've been told. Yes.
Well, no, that's more modeling. No, I'll make up my own mind about that, okay?
Yeah. Some cheeky bugger came back to me and said, no, I have a different view of I have a different definition of modeling, and therefore I'm still going to use the word modeling. Okay, good on you.
Brilliant.
But yeah, just FYI, most people use modeling, as you did, in a very sloppy, unthought out way.
Did you inquire? You just made an assumption. You've just insulted one of our co-interviewers here.
He hasn't pressed stop yet.
Yeah, this is going in. So we've been speaking now for a good length of time. I'm just curious for you gentlemen, if there's anything that you would like to say, any more that you'd like to say just about your perspective, your frame on co-creative TA that you think is important for an audience to hear.
No, I don't believe a word. Make up your own mind. Go exploring. I think the way I think about it is that Keith and I tussled. We generate some material. We offer it with love and freedom to the community. Please take it, tear it apart, think about it, adapt it, build your own thing. Perhaps ignore it if it doesn't touch you at all. That's the spirit, I think, of what we're offering. Principally, we've done it for ourselves. And if it adds meaning and is helpful for other people, then that is wonderful. But we didn't set out to tell other people how to think. We're just trying to tussle things between us. And that's been a delightful process. And I'm so proud of that. So yeah, please take it with our blessing, with love. Do what you want with it as you need to.
I think that's lovely and very typical of your generosity, Graeme. And it is, we love each other. We've been mates for a long time. We've tussled a lot and continue to tussle and enjoy that. And I think there's something I was going to say. I think the thing that gets me is some of the misinterpretations and the kind of maybe even slight name calling. But I was thinking, in the same spirit as you've just offered there, Graeme, I would invite people, if people have a strong reactivity or they think it's only counselling or whatever, I'd be curious about that. Why do people think that? Because we focus more on the present, because we focus more on the adult. Why does that mean? So I think if people have a reaction or reactivity, or use words like modeling, I invite them to, invite people to reflect on it rather than kind of do some of the name calling or some of the kind of discounting.
I had a thought about that earlier and I didn't say it, so I want to say it now, which is that, I'm curious about that whole bit, Keith, because it almost feels like that's psychotherapy as an entity trying to defend its existence, because without the existence of pathology, can psychotherapy really exist? That's what I get curious about. Is it really those individuals, or is it more the thing? Because psychotherapy is so built on the idea that there is ill health in the first place. The idea of you guys saying, oh, we don't need to look for pathology really challenges some of the foundations of psychotherapy. And I think that sometimes people's reactions and responses maybe are not their own.
So I think psychotherapy is much bigger than that view of psychotherapy. So this is another whole podcast.
Yeah.
It's partly on, relational psychotherapy, founded supposedly fully formed in 1987, not true. But I think there are some vested interests in some psychotherapy quarters to see psychotherapy as only, particularly psychodynamic form, originating from Freud and so on. And there's lots of other different traditions, including those that predate Freud. So but with Steiner in defining psychotherapy as soul healing, and that just opens things out much more. That's what the word actually means. So it doesn't rely on psychopathology.
That feels really important.
It also feels a bit full circle, John, because you mentioned sinology right at the beginning of the podcast here. And it is important to look at what goes wrong, what distresses us, what's hurt us, and figure out ways of working with that and through that. I think that's incredibly important. Now, I don't think we're saying ignore psychopathology and just focus on psychosinology. I think we're offering a model that can look at both.
Yeah, both and. Beautiful. I love your intuition, John, having criticised your use of a particular word, which we won't mention again. I know we can be, also have a rough and tumble.
Have therapy on the fact that you call me sloppy next week. It's all right.
I'm glad to be the source of some further work for you.
You're the grit in the oyster, Keith.
I'm the grit in the oyster. Oh, what was that thing you said about being the interface? I feel like I was a graphical
user interface.
I'm a graphical interface.
No, it wasn't that kind. You're the grit.
Anyway, I was offering you a compliment, John, to appreciate your sort of sense of reflection and returning to something that you knew was important.
Yeah, something I often wonder about. So when it came up, I thought, I should nab this now and see.
You're being thorough, so you can be sloppy and thorough at the same time. I mean, that's yeah.
I am many things, Keith.
You are many things. Is there anything else you'd like? I know we're wrapping up, and you've kindly put this back on us as the guys.
Well, I'd like to say one other thing, just by way of wrapping up, which is it's an appreciation of both of you. Similarly, I've really enjoyed your podcast, and it's a shame we took so long to kind of get to you. But I'm glad you persisted and we got to you. This is amazing. I really love what you're doing. I've really enjoyed the previous podcasts. Every podcast I've listened to, I've enjoyed. And I've also really loved your openness here. We did agree to, in some ways, improvise between us here. And I love the spirit in which you've really facilitated this whole thing. So I just want to say a big, huge thank you to yourselves, Matt and John. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think actually our approach when we set up the podcast was very much about it being a co-created experience for us, between me and John and the guests. And so you very much influenced the way in which we decided to approach these interviews, which are not really, they're chats with lots of curiosity.
And also to ruffle a few feathers.
That's John more than me.
We also got feedback in the beginning about our efforts.
We did. And we carried on. So yeah, it's great. I've been hoping to get this conversation in we've been trying to do this for years. So we're really thankful for this opportunity. I think this is a really important conversation for our little library, our audio library of TA conversations that we're going to put out there. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I do various delays, but I also think sometimes, when I get I was saying to you earlier about a book that's been delayed in publication. I'm thinking, well, it's not going to change the world. It comes out 5 months later. So I do think this has a maturity, and it's been nice to do it on the back of having spent more time with Graeme last year live, because I was over in the UK and then Montpellier and so on. So I think it has, and then I met you, Matt. So I think there's a kind of, it feels right. I am sorry for the delay, and I'm also in a way not sorry, because I think it's created something else. So thank you both. It's great, and appreciate your time and interest and resources.
Awesome.
Close it there. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please leave us a review. Leaving a review allows more people to discover the podcast, so you can scroll down to the ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts and click Write a Review. If you haven't already, please follow us wherever you get your podcasts from. We're available on all major podcast platforms. For more information, you can visit our website, www.tapodcast.com, or follow on all the usual social media platforms. This podcast is brought to you in partnership with the United Kingdom Association for Transactional Analysis, the European Association for Transactional Analysis, and our wonderful Patreon supporters.